Luke Timmerman, the moderator of this session, founder and editor of Timmerman Report, biotech journalist, wearing lots of hats these days, and avid user and consumer of social media, mainly Twitter. Just real quick, I want to introduce our fellow panelists. We've got a really diverse crew, a good group of people here. So to my immediate right, Laura Strong. She's the president of Quintessence Biosciences out of Madison, Wisconsin, small private company, and she can tell us a little bit about how she has made good use of Twitter from a small company point of view. To her right, Ryan McBride. I've known Ryan for many years. He used to work with me at Xconomy as a journalist. He's now doing social media management at Novartis. So some big company experience there. And on the end, Adam Feuerstein. Everybody knows Adam.
The most feared man in biotech.
You get that stamped on your forehead. That would be cool. Right. But Adam is one of the more avid journalists. Most every biotech journalist I know is active on Twitter in one way or another. But Adam really likes to mix it up, and he can tell us about the pros and cons of that. So I figure maybe a good way to start, because every one of us is going to have a slightly different perspective on this. What is Twitter good for in what you do? Who wants to take a crack at that?
I'll go first. Twitter's really great for sharing news, company news, things that are happening in the now and that day, things that are relevant and timely. I think we use a lot of different social media channels, and that is what really stands out as the top uses of Twitter for us.
I would agree that news is a big part of it. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. News is a big part of it. So from kind of the company perspective, looking at it and saying, what can we learn from what people are sharing, whether it's journalists or competitive companies, whether it's thought leaders, you can really learn a lot from Twitter. On the other side of it, you don't want to just learn, you probably want to engage and share as well. You want to share your own news, you want to share other things in the related areas that are interesting so that you can cultivate relationships.
So can I ask you a question? Like, just, I don't know, maybe by a show of hands, like, what kind of people are in, like, who's in this audience? Are you, like, do you work for big companies? Are you kind of work for small startups? Or what?
Yeah, startups want to raise
just
your
kind of
hand.
get a sense of, like, who we're talking to audience-wise. So startups, big
Handful.
company,
So about
consultants. So, I mean, you know, obviously we have a broad, you know, we have a cross-section of people. I mean, for me, you know, I think most people probably, you know, I'm putting news on Twitter. So, like, I mean, I use Twitter to sort of get my reporting out, broadly disseminated, broadly distributed beyond what's published. Well, it's really what I publish on the street, but then, you know, sort of broadcast out onto Twitter. And I also use it to, you know, collect information to kind of as a sort of sounding board, as a water cooler, you know, in terms of just kind of discussing what is going on in biotech that day. And then I guess probably a lot of you are looking at what I'm writing to kind of see what's going on, either sort of daily or, you know, because I'm sort of, that's kind of my job, is to sort of be out there to kind of let you guys know what's going on.
Yeah, and I would say I use it for similar reasons. This is one way people want to consume the things that I write. So I put things out there on Forbes, from Timmerman Report, plug my book from time to time. Try not to do that too much. But I think one of the best things too, and I think Adam and I think everybody here would agree, is the networking ability. So I've gotten to know Laura through Twitter. Never would have probably met her otherwise. Or maybe you would have hired a PR firm to say, hey, call Luke or Adam or something like that. And I mean, there were ways before, but this way, I find it makes it much easier to get to build personal relationships with people. You know, you get to know what you have in common that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Laura is a Badger, University of Wisconsin, go Badgers, and so am I. So there you go. And we can use that as a jumping off point to talk about whatever it is that's going on in her company that may or may not be news. So it sort of greases the wheels of social interaction, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the thing that you guys are both talking about, and I think resonates through all of what we do, is really it's about that interaction. It's about the engagement, the conversations. whether you know people or whether it's new people, you actually have this essentially real-time feedback on the stories that you write, on the news that you share, the opinions that you're giving. So it's really just a very active, engaged conversation that happens to be on Twitter.
Now, with that activity and engagement comes a downside. And I would say I've been guilty of this. I've found myself distracted or kind of falling down a rabbit hole, debating with people over things that really aren't that important. And Adam, I know we talked about this earlier. You had kind of a digital detox recently.
I did, yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
Tell us why did you feel you needed to do that?
Yeah. So as essential as Twitter is for my job, and kind of sort of for my life, it's also incredibly time consuming and distracting. Like, you can really get sort of bogged down in Twitter. And I do find myself, everyone sort of follows this, has kind of their own way of sort of how many people you follow and how you use Twitter. But I really do find, especially now, during the election season when there's so much stuff going on, you sort of do find yourself sitting, and I've got 2 computer screens on my desk, and I'm sort of working on something, and I've got Twitter over here on a big screen watching it, and like you just sort of find yourself always sort of going over to it. Oh yeah, let me see what Donald said today, and let me see what oh yeah, let me look at that cute dog gif. At the end of the day, you find that, like, I often found myself really wasting a lot of time, like just being unproductive, where I should have been sort of focused on making phone calls, writing more stories. I was bogged down, and I could find like 2 hours go by and I'm like clicking on Twitter links. So I did. I went on vacation and I got rid of Twitter. I took it off my phone and just vowed not to be on the platform at all for 10 days. And it was when I came back, I sort of had this awakening, like, yeah, you know what, I need it, but I waste a lot of time. So what I did when I came back, and this is kind of getting to the point, is that I really sort of sharply focused my sort of the Twitter feed that I look at on a daily basis to kind of the essential people that I want to follow in terms of like biotech stuff, like work. And I can see that on my computer screen, and it's there. But all the other stuff, the sports people I follow, and the politics stuff I follow, and the beer people I follow, I move them all off. They're in another part of my Twitter feed that I do not see during the day.
Check them at happy hour.
Right. And I found, I do find, it's just been like a week or so since I did this, but I do find that it's helped to just sort of be more focused, because there's just so much going on. It's like this big, fire hose of information that's out there, and you can just get, I'm already, like, the internet has already made me sort of ADD, and it just sort of adds to that. So doing that and trying to be more focused has really, I think, is is something that's very beneficial.
Now, you and I have a little different experience being journalists. Like, it's our job to write things, to have opinions, say things, and then, of course, when you do that, and people make comments, it is part of our job to respond to that, and decide which things we need to respond to and which we don't. But for companies, it's a little different. Things are, you have to be aware that you're not just speaking with your own individual voice. You represent a large organization. So how spontaneous can you be?
Yeah, I think, well, just to come back to your other point about being in a business and not getting bogged down and burnt out on Twitter or using it for different reasons, I think it's a good idea to take a step back if you're a business, especially a startup with limited funds, and think about, why am I using this? And let's think about it as like social media and digital in general, and get to a point where you can select where your audience is and what are the big priorities, what are the things that are going to move things forward for your business. And in answer your question about how do you be spontaneous in our environment, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. There are reviews, there are news items, there are priorities, there are stakeholders. So there's a lot of planning. I would say also you have to think about your presence on social media beyond just your corporate presence and your company presence. Are you empowering people who work for you to talk about the company in a social media context? And I would say that is one way to get to be more spontaneous. But saying something as the company does take a bit of coordination and planning compared with something like, or someone like a cell biologist who is really passionate about every issue of Cell or Nature or Cell Bio that comes out and is able to share that right away. And that kind of comes back to the company and people recognize where that person works.
See, I find that sort of, I understand where you're coming from, but I also find it sort of soul crushing. Because like Twitter is supposed to be, I mean, Twitter is supposed to be like kind of, I mean, you know, at its best, it's more spontaneous, free form. Now, like God knows, like don't do what I do. I mean, I don't, you know, like I wouldn't recommend any company like taking my advice from me on Twitter in terms of like how to just sort of step over the line and say inappropriate things, because I do that all the time. But
The F word.
often, but at the same time, I think, you know, the companies that I follow, I can't say that I get a lot out of following companies on Twitter, because, you know, what do I get? I get, you know, the press release retweeted to me, and it's like, all right, well, you know, what am I doing with that? I've seen that already.
Yeah.
I think the best, you know, there's got to be some kind of medium where, yeah, you want to get your news out, but there's got to be some more kind of interactive presence on Twitter. And I don't have an answer necessarily. I mean, for big companies, clearly, I know there's all kinds of layers and levels, and it's difficult to, you know, you have you know, there's like all kinds of regulations and things that compliance issues that you have to deal with. But I just wish that companies were a little bit more kind of just freeform and interactive on Twitter, where, you know, you can look, I mean, you know, to get your sort of message out there and talk about the issues of the day, that just seems a little bit more real to me.
Yeah, and I think there are ways to do that. I mean, I think you have to sort of separate, as a brand, you have to separate what it is that you do, your own products and all of your programs, from things that are, you know, related but interesting. And I think those are the kinds of things that you share, because then you can build value for the community beyond just sharing your information. And I agree with you, Adam. I think when you don't do that, it sounds like you're just, you know, broadcasting your own news in a new digital medium, which isn't really all that interesting. I don't know that I actually follow any brands on Twitter. I follow people who maybe are related to brands, who actually share related information, but brands themselves, I think it's really difficult to create an authentic voice when all you share is your own stuff.
I think, you know, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I would agree with you. I think that pharma in general needs to move toward more of a real-time presence on social media. And I think that when you start to unpack all the different layers of things that you need to consider, I think you get closer to that. But I would also stress that as a business and as a startup, or if you're Novartis, you have to go into this with business goals. And if your business goal is to be awesome at Twitter, then you need to take a step back again and reconsider, because you know, you're faced with limited time, limited funds. Your business challenges are more likely to be engaging with investors and putting your best foot forward so that you can keep this whole thing going.
Yeah, a good example of someone, I think, I mean, you know, Brent Saunders from Allergan is on Twitter, and he's got his own, you know, Twitter account, and I think he does a pretty, I mean, I don't know what you guys think. I mean, I think he does a pretty decent job on Twitter of kind of, you know, talking about company news, but then also there's other stuff in there that he talks about that are related maybe to industry things. Sometimes it's a little bit hokey and a little bit cheerleadery, but you kind of expect that from you know, the CEO of a big company. But, you know, if you guys wanted to sort of get an example of kind of how a big company, I think, that deals with social media, deals with Twitter effectively, you should look at Brent Saunders' Twitter feed. It's a pretty good one.
Bruce Booth is another good one from the venture capital community. I mean, not only does he write about the industry well, but you know, he'll comment on the occasional article. Let's say a hot issue of the day, like drug pricing. What do you think there, Bruce? And you know, I don't think that causes him any serious problems or backlash with his business. I mean, a lot of people would be afraid to do that, but
yeah, I think you have to be, you know, not all of us can be Adam, so you have to be conscious of the fact that you might be saying something that could be controversial, and you just, for most of us, we can't say it in the way Adam does. We have to say it in a slightly different way. And I think Bruce does that. He brings up topics that are difficult. People agree or disagree, but it doesn't kind of get into a slugfest. Everybody seems to be fairly cordial about the disagreement. But I guess coming back to the question of, you do have to have a goal for Twitter, and it can't just be, as a company, I'm going to be awesome at Twitter. I helped another company actually start their Twitter campaigns, and sat down with them and really focused on, what is the outreach you want to do. And this is a medical software company, and they really wanted to reach customers. They wanted to reach their thought leaders, and so we designed actually a program for them to follow people in all of those different segments, and then they can engage with people when they see them interacting online. So, I think you start with the goal of what the business wants to achieve through Twitter or whatever the social media is, and then you design your program from that, who you're going to follow, what topics you're going to engage on, those sorts of things. And I do think you have to be very structured, very dedicated, because otherwise you will end up just spending a lot of time for something that really has no value for the business.
So you're like a part-time social media consultant? Who knew?
I think Bruce is a great example, too, of someone who really found an opening to engage an audience of entrepreneurs and people who really didn't understand the venture capital world as well as they wanted to. And with his blog and his Twitter presence, he was able to kind of drive a wedge into the conversation and become an influencer. And he doesn't just think about Twitter, of course, because he's got LifeSci VC, the blog, and he's got now multiple contributors. And so Bruce is a smart investor, and I think he looks at social media and digital as an investment in his company, because now he's got all these entrepreneurs and even LPs that look at his blog and really know more about Atlas and want to know more and interact with them.
Now, the thing that I would say, too, and I think Bruce would say that if he was here, and that is, you have to be consistent. I mean, this takes work. You have to write periodically and think through what you want to say, and you can't just pop up once every year and say, oh, gee, we had a meeting and we want to do social media now, and then let it peter out, because it'll go nowhere. Questions? I'm sure there must be a few out there. Somebody took our picture.
This is for Ryan and Laura. Do you establish an ROI for your activity? So you guys are a cost center within your companies, I'm sure. How do you define your own internal value?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think it's important to define ROI very clearly in a big company, because, and maybe this isn't, for a startup, it's one group, but, there are different ideas of what ROI are. I think for us, we look at outcomes, and we look at, what are the objectives. So if it's talent recruitment or retention, if it's building awareness, like the brand and reputation, there are ways that we can measure that and quantify it. So, it's good to have KPIs. An actual absolute ROI measure can be difficult to come by if you're not in sales. And there are all kinds of issues loaded up in that in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. And I work in research, so I don't really have an insight into like product sales, and products aren't being sold in the U.S. market on Twitter and social media.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking for the purpose of this conversation mostly about Twitter, because I think that's where the startup and business development and kind of innovation side of the industry is. But in terms of product marketing, sales and marketing, Facebook is probably more of a place, and I'm just not that active and don't really know that side as well. Maybe you do.
Yeah, well, I would say that if you look at the business, if you're in a startup mode, you would be looking at more of a Twitter and looking at your objectives of developing a workforce, engaging investors. Yes, the brand product communities that exist are sometimes on Facebook, but they can also be Twitter communities. And really the focus recently has been to have like a multi-channel presence. So if you look at some of our brand teams, they'll have a Tumblr like blog presence. They'll have the Twitter, YouTube, so that they can reach their audience wherever they are. And so I would, as a startup, also look at channels like LinkedIn and look at your web presence. I mean, I think there's especially today, you can have a pretty professional looking website without a large investment. And I know that websites are still places along the trail that, journalists and investors go to kind of do their due diligence. Should I talk to these people? Is their science really interesting? What's their track record? Are they hitting milestones? Are they, so including the content of your company in a sort of easily accessed place, and Twitter doesn't really achieve that very well. Is important.
It's more ephemeral. Twitter's kind of more ephemeral. I think something like LinkedIn, from a corporate perspective, is much more useful if you just want kind of a solid web presence. Facebook tends to be more for either the brands or for talent recruitment. Sort of LinkedIn is for talent recruitment as well. But yeah, I would say Twitter is kind of ephemeral if what you want is really a strong, lasting presence. But coming back to your question about ROI, I mean, it's difficult to say like, oh, we spent this many hours and we had this, this much come out of it. But I can tell you, so from the perspective of Quintessence, I've had access to journalists, to thought leaders, to potential investors that I never would have otherwise had, in part not just because we're a small company, but also because we're based in Madison, Wisconsin. And, as you know, the epicenter of everything is East Coast, West Coast in terms of biotech. I won't get into the Boston versus California fight, but, it's certainly not Wisconsin, right?
But
so,
when you come here now, you can very easily set up a day full of productive meetings, I would imagine, with people that you've either met directly on Twitter or are kind of 1 or 2 degrees removed.
Absolutely. And they know who I am. It's not just, oh yeah, you met me at a conference once. It's somebody that I in effect talk to, once a week or a couple of times a week, kind of the way that you guys do in a coffee shop or over lunch or drinks. I get that interaction on Twitter. From a kind of more solid perspective, the other company that I helped, this medical software company, we were actually able to set up meetings with thought leaders and with potential customers through the interactions that we had on Twitter. So, again, it's not a direct ROI measurement, but at the same time, would you have had access to those people if you hadn't engaged them and had meaningful conversations beforehand?
Now, I want to follow up on your point about LinkedIn, because I've noticed that getting much more spammy, I think, in the last, year or two. I mean, I use it, I like it, I gather a lot of email addresses, and it's important for my business. But I don't know about updating what you're doing there, or I don't really know how to reach people there.
I think it's a place that information lives. I don't think it's a place to interact.
Yeah, it's not for real-time engagement, but I know in the life science industry there are a lot of people on LinkedIn, and people do go there when they need it. So if they're looking to make a business connection with someone that's on LinkedIn, or they're looking for a job, they'll go to LinkedIn, but they're not going to go there every day typically.
Yeah, I go there to find disgruntled employees. That's basically what I use LinkedIn for.
That is a good use for us as journalists. Question there in the back.
Hi, I'm Donna Lavoie. I have a quick question for Laura and Ryan with regard to social media policies for employees in your respective companies. And I also want to thank you for this great discussion. I think it's important.
Do you have a policy, Laura?
Yeah, we'll start with you, Laura.
I usually point to the Mayo Clinic policy, which I think is short and sweet, and it basically says, don't say anything on social media that you wouldn't say everywhere else in the world. No, it's tough when you have employees that start to associate with the brand. That is a real challenge. I think for a startup company, when you have a handful of employees, it's just easier to ask people not to associate with the brand, because you can't have the kind of vigilance that you have with a larger brand and that many resources. So, I think in startup land it's going to be different than in larger companies. But for the most part, you just ask people to use common sense and to not really engage too much with the brand from an internal perspective.
Yeah, I would agree that having some very clear do's and don'ts, without getting into, there are policies for use of social media, but refreshingly, we have a really easy to read one pager on do's and don'ts for our social media ambassador program, and I think that it's really important to be able to if you're reaching a large number of employees, or even if it's 5 to 10 employees, that you make it very clear and easy to understand, what's really permitted and what they should avoid.
My question kind of leads directly on from that. Your employees, the individuals, are also often your thought leaders, and how do you use Twitter to promote them as thought leadership for your company, and maybe have some more flexibility than if things were coming from your corporate account and they're focused more on branding? How do you tie that into your overall strategy when you have an employee that maybe is your chief medical officer and you want them to be seen, especially as a startup, as an expert in that field?
Yeah, so I think your employees are your best ambassadors, and of course, if you have a thought leader like a CMO, I think what they say about biotechnology is going to be seen as much more credible than perhaps what the company handle says. So I think you definitely have to support that person with just, do they know the company policy? Do they, how do you keep them out of trouble so that they can keep going and doing their thing? Because, they're the, the people that you want to talk to, that others, journalists want to interact with on a daily basis. So I think that's a key thing. That's a great question too. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's about providing them the resource to not have it become a distraction for them, where they can contribute information that gets kind of reworked, remessaged to be compliant, and then is shared either under the brand or under their own name, but is somehow associated with the brand. I think it's the rare, highly technical person that's going to have an easy time bouncing back and forth between what it is their day job is and contributing, short, pithy information on Twitter, or even kind of really engaging blog posts that talk about some interesting new development in the industry.
Yeah, and I would rather follow the CMO or CSO of a company, especially someone who's fairly active, wants to get sort of engaged, than kind of a corporate account or a CEO account, just because that person is obviously directly involved with what the company is about, and especially if they're going to sort of go off, maybe let's say if they're at a conference and they're you might have data presenting at a conference, you're talking about that data, but you're sort of also talking about some larger trends that are going on. That's the kind of account that I would follow and pay attention to, and with the understanding that this person is they work for a company, so they their point of view is going to be sort of not, I don't want to say conflicted, but you know what I mean. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but that's an account that I would find something that I would want to follow.
Yeah, and I guess for individuals like that, I like to see some kind of, and I don't know what the right ratio is or the percentage is, but I don't know, 80% of what this person says is like in their wheelhouse, science, medicine, and then every now and then they sprinkle something in, like I'm running the Boston Marathon this year. I'm going to taking the family to Yellowstone. This is kind of stuff that I will put in there every now and then, and people seem to like it. Mm-hmm. It's how you get to know the person, and not just a talking head or another spokesperson from the company. I think we got time for one more question. Yeah.
Curious what you guys think about sort of the state of the union of BioTwitter, because you hear Twitter taking a lot of flack. You hear Twitter taking a lot of flack for sort of hemorrhaging users and people moving to other platforms. Do you guys think that the state of sort of the BioTwitterverse is still as vibrant and dynamic and sort of useful as it was maybe like a year ago?
Well, I'll take that first. I would say yes. There's a great group of people, but you got to filter out that noise. The election, I think, just has brought out a lot of nasty people and trolls and anonymity, and I found the need to tune a lot of that stuff out. So that I think poses a threat to Twitter longer term. If there's too much anonymity and just too much nastiness, people will turn away. But that there really is a good critical mass there in biotech, and I think that's here to stay.
Yeah, it may have plateaued a little bit. I mean, I don't think it's growing to the extent that it was growing maybe two years ago. But I agree with what Luke said, is that there's a really good, it depends on what you're looking for, right? I mean, I follow lots of different kinds of people, right? I follow sort of the investor type of people, but then I also follow the kind of the geeky, sciencey type of people too. And, so you can pick and choose kind of where what you're targeting, what's of interest to you. But I think that there is a very vibrant active group of people that are on there that are still really engaged. I get a lot out of it. Luke is right. You have to sort of filter out a lot of the noise, but it's good.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I think that I've lost a couple of my kind of key voices over the last year or so on Twitter, and I'm still sort of looking to fill a couple of little gaps that I want kind of more interaction with. But for the most part, I've added some really interesting new people in the same areas that I kind of have interesting people. So I think there is kind of an influx of people. It's just not as fast as when the community was growing initially.
What do you mean lost a couple people? They just went away?
Or they stopped really sharing about the stuff they had been sharing about. Either they switched jobs or, moved into new areas. So.
Yeah, it happens.
So 2 things. I think it's a great question. Just the fact that you're raising the question is significant, because I think we need to look ahead 5-10 years at the next generation of people in biotech and where they're using social media. It's probably not going to be Twitter as much as it is Instagram or Snapchat, and it's going to evolve. I think we need to get more comfortable with these newer platforms. But the second point would be that BioTwitter, I think, is alive and well. They're great kind of community managers, some of which are sitting here, and a lot of the Twitter business struggles and things are just noise to me. They don't mean anything. The Twitter profits and their quarterlies don't mean anything for the vibrancy of that community. But it's a great question about the future of that platform.
But they should be paying us for all the content
Yeah.
we
I
put
was
on
gonna
their
say that,
platform.
yeah.
Until Twitter goes out of business, and then we'll have to find something else to do.
I think we're out of time. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, everybody.
Mhm.